The date is April 18, 1942. The sound you hear is the scream of a Pratt & Whitney engine pushed past its limits. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch is diving through 15,000 feet, his Grumman Wildcat shuddering, the control stick vibrating so violently in his hands that his palms will be bruised for days. Behind him, closing with impossible grace, is a Mitsubishi A6M2. The pilot's name is Saburo Sakai, and he has never been shot down, never been touched. In 3 months of war, he has become something close to untouchable. But in the next 90 seconds, something will happen that neither man expects, not because of superior skill, not because of courage, but because Thatch is about to stop fighting the Zero the way he was trained and start fighting it the way physics demands. This is the story of an aircraft that rewrote the rules of air combat in 1941, dominated the Pacific sky with such totality that Allied pilots called encounters with it barely survivable, and then became, by 1944, a death trap for the men who flew it. But this is really about something deeper, something that transcends engineering and enters the realm of philosophy. It is about the moment when tactical perfection becomes strategic suicide, about what happens when a nation builds its entire doctrine around a weapon that cannot evolve, and what it reveals about the distance between invincibility and obsolescence, between the myth a culture tells itself and the cold mathematics of industrial war. To understand what happened in the skies over the Pacific between 1941 and 1945, you first need to understand what Japan believed, not what they knew, what they believed. The Zero was not just an aircraft, it was the physical manifestation of an ideology. Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized spiritual strength over material advantage, skill over technology, the perfection of the individual over the mass production of the mediocre. Japanese naval aviation doctrine held that a supremely trained pilot in a supremely maneuverable aircraft could defeat any number of lesser enemies. Quality over quantity, excellence over excess, discipline over democracy. The Zero proved this belief, at least it seemed to. When it appeared over China in 1940, it did things no one thought possible. It could turn inside anything in the sky. It could climb faster than planes with twice the engine power. It had a range that defied belief. Flying missions American engineers calculated were physically impossible given fuel capacity and distance. When Pearl Harbor came, and Zeros escorted bombers across hundreds of miles of open ocean to strike with impunity. The myth solidified into doctrine. This was not just a good fighter. This was proof that Japanese philosophy, Japanese training, Japanese spirit could overcome Western material advantage. But here is what they did not tell the pilots. Here is what Saburo Sakai and thousands like him did not fully understand until it was far too late. The Zero's dominance was not just about what it could do, it was about what had been sacrificed to make it do those things. Every engineering decision is a trade-off. You cannot optimize for everything. The Zero was optimized for exactly one thing: maneuverability at the expense of literally everything else. No armor, not light armor, no armor. A single layer of aluminum skin between the pilot and the world. No self-sealing fuel tanks. American aircraft had rubber-lined tanks that would seal around bullet holes. The Zero had bare metal tanks that, when punctured, turned the aircraft into a flying Molotov cocktail. Armament that was devastating in 1940, but could not be upgraded because the airframe was built to the absolute limits of weight tolerance. And an engine, the Sakai 12, that was a masterpiece of efficiency in 1940 and hopelessly outclassed by 1943. These were not oversights. These were deliberate choices made by chief designer Jiro Horikoshi, who understood exactly what he was building. An aircraft for the opening moves of a war Japan expected to win quickly. A weapon designed for pilots so skilled they would not be hit. A philosophy made aluminum. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The world watches as Zeros perform aerial ballet over burning battleships. They face almost no opposition, but when they do, the result is massacre. American fighters, caught on the ground or climbing desperately, are cut apart. The few Wildcats and P-40s that manage to engage discover something terrifying. You cannot dogfight a Zero. The moment you try to turn with it, you are dead. It will get inside your turn radius. It will get guns on you. And those 20mm cannons, while slow firing, hit like sledgehammers. One burst is enough. American pilots who survived their first encounter with a Zero, and many do not, report the same thing. It is not just better. It is fighting with a different rulebook. Across the Pacific, the pattern repeats. Zeros appear over the Philippines, over Malaya, over the Dutch East Indies. Allied fighters designed for European warfare, for predictable enemies, for conventional combat, face an aircraft that seems to operate outside the normal constraints of physics. How can something so light turn so quickly? How can it climb at that angle? How can it possibly have the range to be here, hundreds of miles from the nearest carrier? The answer to all these questions is the same: sacrifice. But in early 1942 it looks like genius. By March 1942, Japan controls a vast maritime empire. The Zero is not just winning, it is crushing opposition. Allied air forces in the Pacific are shattered. Pilot losses are catastrophic, not just because of the Zero's performance, but because of what that performance does to morale. When you know that engaging the enemy is likely suicide, when you know that pilots far braver and more skilled than you have died trying to fight this thing, it does something to your mind. You stop thinking about how to win. You start thinking about how to survive. This is the invisible advantage of a dominant weapon. It warps the psychology of everyone who faces it. But here is where the story begins to turn. Because while Japanese pilots are accumulating victories, and Japanese commanders are congratulating themselves on the superiority of their philosophy, something else is happening. American engineers are learning. American tacticians are adapting. And American industry is preparing to do something Japan fundamentally did not believe was possible. Not match the Zero, overwhelm it. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch did not have a better aircraft. He had a Grumman F4F Wildcat, which was in almost every measurable way inferior to the Zero. It was slower, it climbed worse. Its turn radius was so much wider that trying to dogfight a Zero was not brave, it was suicidal. But Thatch had something else. He had survivors, pilots who had faced Zeros and lived, who had seen what it could do, who had watched friends die and then spent sleepless nights trying to understand why. Thatch gathered these men and asked a question that sounds simple but was actually revolutionary. If we cannot outmaneuver the Zero, how do we outthink it? The answer became the Thatch weave, and it was the first crack in the myth of Japanese invincibility. Here is how it worked. Two Wildcats fly parallel courses about 200 feet apart. A Zero attacks one. The targeted Wildcat turns toward his wingman. The Zero, confident in its turning ability, follows. But as the Zero commits to the turn, the second Wildcat, who has been turning the opposite direction, suddenly has a shot, a crossing shot. The Zero pilot realizes too late that he has turned into a firing solution. He breaks off, but now the geometry has reversed. The first Wildcat is in position to fire. Back and forth, mutual support, making the Zero's greatest advantage, its ability to turn inside anything, irrelevant. When Thatch first demonstrated this tactic, some veteran pilots dismissed it. It felt defensive, it felt like admitting inferiority. But the ones who used it survived. And the ones who survived taught others. And slowly, agonizingly, the Pacific Air War stopped being about individual duels and became about systems, about tactics, about using your aircraft's strengths instead of trying to match the enemy's. The Wildcat was tough. It could take damage that would obliterate a Zero and keep flying. It could dive faster. Its guns, 650 caliber Brownings, fired twice as fast as the Zero's cannons. If you did not try to turn with a Zero, if you used diving attacks and refused to be drawn into circling combat, you could win. Not because you outflew the enemy, because you outthought them. This was the beginning of the end for Japanese tactical dominance, but they did not know it yet, because they were still winning, still accumulating victories, still confirming their own belief system. This is how certainty becomes a trap. The Zero was so good at what it did that it blinded Japanese commanders to what was coming. June 1942, Midway. This is where the myth begins to die in public, though the private death started earlier. 4 Japanese carriers burning, the Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had terrorized the Pacific, shattered in a single day. But focus for a moment, not on the carriers but on the Zeros that tried to defend them. They shot down dozens of attacking aircraft, devastated torpedo bomber squadrons, performed exactly as designed. And it did not matter, because while Zeros were massacring low-level attackers, American dive bombers were screaming down from 15,000 feet, and there was nothing the Zeros could do. They could not climb fast enough, could not reach altitude in time. The fundamental limitation of the Zero's design, optimization for low to medium altitude maneuverability, meant it struggled in the high-altitude environment American doctrine increasingly demanded. And when those dive bombers put 1,000-pound bombs into carrier flight decks, when the Kido Butai burned, the Zeros had nowhere to land. They circled until their fuel ran out, then ditched in the ocean. Perfection is brittle. The Zero was the most maneuverable fighter in the world, but maneuverability could not stop a bomb from 15,000 feet, could not extend range when your carrier was gone, could not adapt to a battlefield that was changing faster than Japanese doctrine could process. August 1942. Guadalcanal. The grinding begins. This is where the war stops being about decisive carrier battles and becomes about attrition, about logistics, about who can replace losses faster. And this is where the Zero's fundamental vulnerabilities start to kill pilots in numbers that cannot be ignored. The Americans are learning. Every engagement produces data. Wreckage is analyzed. Tactics are refined. But more than that, new aircraft are arriving. The F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning, and in 1943, the aircraft that will finally break the Zero's back, the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat is not as maneuverable as the Zero. It is not trying to be. It is faster. It is tougher. It has armor. It has self-sealing tanks. It has an engine with so much power that it can simply outmuscle the Zero in vertical maneuvers. And it has something else. It has pilots trained specifically to fight Zeros, using tactics developed from 3 years of hard-won experience. The Hellcat does not try to dogfight. It dives, fires, extends, climbs, repeats, boom and zoom. And when a Zero tries to follow into a dive, one of two things happens. Either the Zero pulls out and the Hellcat escapes, or the Zero pushes the dive too far, too fast, and the airframe, built to minimum weight tolerances, begins to come apart. Wings shear. Control surfaces fail. The Zero becomes a coffin tumbling toward the ocean. But here is what makes this tragedy rather than just history. Japanese industry could not respond. Not would not. Could not. The United States was producing thousands of fighters per month by 1943. Thousands. Japan's entire annual production of all aircraft types was less than what American factories turned out in a single month. When a Hellcat was shot down, another appeared within days. When a Zero was lost, it might be weeks or months before a replacement arrived. And the pilots. American pilot training programs were producing aviators with hundreds of hours of flight time. Japan, desperately short of fuel, short of instructors, short of time, was sending pilots into combat with 50 hours, sometimes less. They were strapping teenagers into Zeros and sending them against veterans in superior aircraft. The result was not combat. It was slaughter. By 1944, the average lifespan of a Japanese naval aviator was measured in weeks. The Zero, that masterpiece of 1940 design, was now a liability. Its lack of armor meant even a glancing hit could be fatal. Its lack of self-sealing tanks meant any hit to the fuel system was a death sentence. And its light armament, perfect for lightly built 1940-era fighters, could not reliably bring down the heavily armored American aircraft now filling the sky. There is a moment that captures this better than any statistics. October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Saburo Sakai, the pilot from our opening, one of the greatest aces Japan ever produced, is flying combat air patrol. He sees a formation of Hellcats. He has shot down dozens of aircraft in his career. He knows he is more skilled than most of the American pilots he faces, and he does not engage. He cannot. The mathematics are impossible. If he shoots down one, the others will shred his Zero before he can escape. If he tries to run, they are faster. If he tries to climb, they will follow. His only option is to hide in clouds and hope they do not see him. This is what had become of Japanese air superiority. The best pilots in the world in aircraft that once dominated the sky, reduced to hiding. Not because they lacked courage, because they lacked options. The Zero had become a technological dead end, and there was no time, no resources, no industrial capacity to develop a replacement. So they kept building Zeros, kept sending pilots into combat in aircraft that were obsolete, kept sacrificing lives to maintain the illusion that fighting spirit could overcome material reality. And then it gets darker. When conventional tactics failed, when it became clear that Japanese pilots could not stop the American advance, the Zero found its final, most terrible purpose. Kamikaze, the ultimate expression of the philosophy that had created it. If the pilot is willing to die, if the mission is one way, then the Zero's lack of armor and self-sealing tanks stop being weaknesses. They become irrelevant. A Zero loaded with explosives, flown by a pilot with just enough training to take off and point the aircraft at a ship, becomes a guided missile, deadly, terrifying, and utterly unsustainable. Japan was burning its future, one pilot at a time, because the present had become unwinnable. The Zero, designed as the ultimate expression of air-to-air superiority, ended the war as a cruise missile made of aluminum and desperation. Young men, barely trained, climbing into cockpits knowing they would not return. Might not, would not. This was the plan. The Zero's final kill ratio was not measured in enemy aircraft destroyed. It was measured in tons of American shipping, damaged per pilot killed. This is what happens when tactical excellence hardens into strategic paralysis. When the weapon you built for victory becomes the weapon you use for sacrifice. Let us go back to the engineering, because this is not a story about Japanese failure. It is a story about the limits of perfection. Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero's designer, was a genius. The A6M2 was one of the finest aircraft designs of its era, but he designed it with constraints: limited engine power, limited industrial capacity, a tactical doctrine that emphasized first strike capability and assumed a short war. Every choice he made was rational given those constraints. No armor. The Sakai engine could not lift armor and still achieve the performance requirements. No self-sealing tanks. The rubber lining added weight and reduced fuel capacity, and range was non-negotiable. Light armament. Heavier guns meant more weight, meant less maneuverability. Each decision was a conscious trade-off. The problem was not the design. The problem was that the design could not evolve. When American fighters got faster, the Zero could not add engine power without a complete redesign. When American armor got thicker, the Zero could not upgrade its guns without exceeding weight limits. When tactics changed, when the air war moved to higher altitudes, when attrition became the deciding factor, the Zero was locked into its 1940 configuration. It was a perfect answer to a question that was no longer being asked. This is the philosophy underneath the history. Perfection is static. Adaptability is survival. The Zero was so highly optimized for one tactical scenario that it could not adjust when that scenario changed. Meanwhile, American aircraft were designed with growth in mind. The Hellcat went through multiple engine upgrades. The Corsair kept getting more powerful, more capable. They were not perfect, they were adaptable. And in war, in any competitive environment, adaptability beats perfection every single time. Because the environment changes, the enemy learns, and what worked yesterday becomes suicide tomorrow. Japan built an air force around a philosophy that could not bend, could not admit imperfection, could not pivot when the evidence became overwhelming. And so pilots died, not because they lacked skill, not because they lacked courage, but because the system they served valued ideological purity over pragmatic adaptation. There is another layer here. The human cost of institutional denial. By 1943, Japanese pilots knew the Zero was outclassed. They flew it anyway. Japanese engineers knew the design was obsolete. They kept building it anyway. Because the alternative was admitting that the philosophy, the national myth of Japanese superiority, the belief that spirit could overcome material, was wrong. And that admission was, in the context of wartime Japan, unthinkable. So they kept fighting, kept dying, kept sacrificing young men to a doctrine that had already failed. This is what happens when a system becomes more important than the individuals within it. When preserving the illusion of strength becomes more important than the survival of the people that strength is supposed to protect. The Zero pilots of 1944 knew they were being sent to die. They went anyway. Not because they were brainwashed, though propaganda played its role, but because in the context of their culture, their duty, their identity, there was no alternative they could imagine. This is the weight of ideology. It does not feel like a choice. It feels like destiny. Let us talk about one pilot specifically. His name was Takeo Tanemizu. He was 19 years old in 1944. He had 53 hours of flight time when he was assigned to a Zero squadron. American pilots at that point had an average of 300 hours before seeing combat. Tanemizu flew 11 missions. On his 12th, he encountered a division of Hellcats over the Philippine Sea. He followed his training. He tried to outmaneuver them. His Zero could still turn inside a Hellcat, still had that advantage. But the Hellcats did not try to turn with him. They used the Thatch weave, the same tactic John Thatch had developed 2 years earlier, now standard doctrine. Tanemizu committed to a target. A second Hellcat crossed his flight path and fired a 2-second burst. 50 caliber rounds, armor-piercing incendiary, walked across his wing route and into his fuel tank. The Zero did not explode. It ignited. There is a difference. An explosion is instant. A fire gives you time to understand what is happening. Tanemizu had perhaps 10 seconds, long enough to realize he was burning, long enough to reach for the canopy release and discover it was jammed, long enough to know he was going to burn to death. The Zero hit the water at 300 kilometers per hour. They never found the wreckage. This happened thousands of times. The only reason we know Tanemizu's story is because another pilot saw it happen and survived long enough to write it down. What does it mean to die for a machine that your commanders know is obsolete? What does it mean to climb into a cockpit knowing the aircraft cannot protect you, cannot outperform the enemy, cannot give you a reasonable chance of survival? It means you are not fighting a war anymore. You are participating in a ritual sacrifice, and the cruelty is that the pilots often did not blame the aircraft. They blamed themselves. Japanese pilot training emphasized spiritual strength. If you were shot down, the ideology suggested, it was because your spirit was insufficiently pure, your dedication insufficiently complete. Not because you were flying a 1940 fighter against a 1944 enemy. Not because your aircraft had no armor. Your fault. Your weakness. This is how systems perpetuate themselves even as they devour the people within them, by making failure personal rather than structural. The technical analysis is important. The Zero's maximum speed was 534 kilometers per hour. The Hellcat's was 629. The Zero could turn inside the Hellcat at low speeds. The Hellcat could dive away, and the Zero could not follow without risking structural failure. The Zero's two 20mm cannons had a rate of fire of 490 rounds per minute combined. The Hellcat's 650 caliber guns fired 800 rounds per minute combined. The Zero had no armor. The Hellcat had armor behind the pilot, around the engine, around the fuel tanks. One aircraft was designed to avoid being hit. The other was designed to survive being hit. In 1941, when Japanese pilots had thousands of hours of training and American pilots were green, the Zero's philosophy worked. By 1944, when the roles had reversed, it became a death sentence. But beyond the numbers, beyond the specifications, there is a human question. How do you keep fighting when you know you are going to lose? When every mission might be your last, not because of bad luck, but because of bad design. Some pilots became fatalistic, some became reckless. Some volunteered for kamikaze missions because at least then the death had purpose, had meaning, was not just random chance and obsolete engineering. Here is the thing about the kamikaze program. It was not insanity. It was logic. Terrible logic, but logic nonetheless. If you have pilots with minimal training, aircraft that are obsolete, and no industrial capacity to change either factor, then using those pilots as guided missiles produces more military effect per resource expended than conventional tactics. A Zero in a dogfight might get shot down and accomplish nothing. A Zero flown into a ship might sink that ship. It is monstrous calculus, but it is calculus. and it reveals something about what happens when a military reaches the end of options. When there is no good choice, only terrible choices and worse choices. The Zero, which began the war as a symbol of Japanese technical and tactical superiority, ended it as the delivery vehicle for institutionalized suicide. This is what it looks like when a weapon system becomes a liability, but you have no alternative. You keep using it. You just change what using it means. There is a report, declassified decades after the war, written by an American intelligence officer who interrogated surviving Japanese pilots. One section stands out. The officer asked a veteran Zero pilot, a man who had survived from 1942 to 1945, what he thought of the aircraft. The pilot's answer was translated as follows: "It was the finest aircraft in the world in 1941. It was adequate in 1942. It was obsolete in 1943. By 1944, flying it was suicide. By 1945, it was already a coffin, and we were just waiting for it to close." The interviewer asked why they kept flying it. The pilot did not answer directly. He said, "What choice did we have? This is the question underneath the entire history. What do you do when the system demands something impossible? When duty requires you to fly a mission you know you will not survive? When the aircraft, the tactics, the strategy are all demonstrably failing, but the alternative is admitting everything you have fought for was based on a flawed premise. Most people, in that situation, do their duty. They climb into the cockpit. They fly the mission. They die. Not because they are stupid, because the alternative is stepping outside the only framework they have for understanding who they are. Let us go back to John Thatch one more time. In 1945, after the war, he wrote a tactical analysis of the Zero for the US Navy. It is a remarkable document, respectful, analytical, devoid of triumphalism. He describes the Zero as possibly the finest dogfighting aircraft ever built. He notes that in the hands of an expert pilot, in the right tactical situation, it remained deadly even at the end of the war. But then he writes this: "The Zero's tragedy was that it was too good at what it did. It allowed Japanese doctrine to ossify. It created a generation of pilots trained to fight in a way that became suicidal as the war progressed. And because it was so effective early on, because it confirmed Japanese beliefs about the superiority of their approach, it prevented adaptation until adaptation was impossible." Thatch understood something that transcends aviation. Success can be more dangerous than failure, because failure forces you to change. Success tells you to keep doing what you are doing, and if what you are doing is only effective in a narrow set of circumstances, and those circumstances change, you are suddenly doing the wrong thing with total conviction. The final loss ratio tells the story. In 1941, Zeros achieved a kill ratio of approximately 12 to 1. For every Zero lost, 12 Allied aircraft were shot down. By 1942, it was 6 to 1. By 1943, 2 to 1. By 1944, it had reversed. American fighters were shooting down 3 Zeros for every loss. By 1945, the ratio was approaching 10 to 1 in favor of the Americans. The Zero had not changed. The world around it had. American pilots were better trained. American aircraft were more capable. American tactics were refined through years of hard combat. And American industry was producing so many aircraft that losses were irrelevant. Japan could not replace losses, could not retrain pilots, could not redesign the Zero, so the curve just kept getting worse. More pilots dead, more missions failed, more desperate tactics, until the only thing left was flying the aircraft into the enemy and hoping the explosion accomplished something the guns could not. There is one more story. April 7, 1945, the battleship Yamato's final mission. Accompanying it were 8 destroyers and a combat air patrol of Zeros. They were heading toward Okinawa with no fuel for the return journey. A one-way mission. The Zeros knew they would run out of fuel over open ocean. The plan was to fight until the tanks were empty, then ditch. No one expected to survive. American intelligence detected the fleet hours before it reached Okinawa. Nearly 400 aircraft, Hellcats and Corsairs and Avengers, swarmed the formation. The Zeros fought. They shot down 10 American aircraft. They fought with the skill and desperation of men who knew this was the end. And then they started falling. Not because they were shot down, though many were, because they ran out of fuel. Zeros ditching into the ocean, pilots drowning in their cockpits or struggling in the water with no rescue possible. The Americans did not even need to shoot them all down. They just had to wait. This is what the Zero had become, an aircraft with no endurance, no support, no future. Flown by men with no illusions, no hope, no choice. They fought anyway, not because they thought they would win, because fighting was all that was left. So what do we take from this? What does the story of the Zero reveal about war, about technology, about the distance between ideology and reality? It reveals that excellence in the wrong context becomes liability. That optimization for past conditions creates vulnerability to future changes. That success can be more blinding than failure because it confirms beliefs that may no longer be true. It reveals something about human beings, about how we respond when the system we believed in fails, but we are still trapped within it. Most of us, if we are honest, would do what those pilots did. We would fly the mission. We would follow the doctrine. We would rationalize and adapt and try to find meaning in the impossible. Because stepping outside the system, admitting that everything we have sacrificed for was based on a flawed premise, is harder than dying. This is not about courage. Those pilots had more courage than most of us will ever need. This is about the weight of ideology, about what happens when the stories we tell ourselves about who we are collide with evidence that those stories are myths, about the gap between what we believe and what is true, and how much pain lives in that gap. The Zero was not a bad aircraft. It was a perfect aircraft for a war that did not happen, for a short conflict decided by decisive battles fought by elite pilots in maneuverable fighters. That war never existed. The actual war was long, grinding, industrial, decided by logistics and production and the ability to absorb losses and adapt. In that war, the Zero was a relic from the first day, but no one could admit it. Not the designers who had staked their reputations on it, not the commanders who had built doctrine around it, not the pilots who had to believe the aircraft they flew every day gave them a chance. So they kept flying, kept fighting, kept dying, until there were no more Zeros, no more pilots, no more illusions left to burn. The last Zero was shot down on August 15, 1945. The same day Japan surrendered. The pilot was 17 years old. He had 31 hours of flight time. He never had a chance. None of them did. Not because they lacked skill or courage or will, but because they were fighting with a weapon designed for a different war, following a doctrine that no longer worked, in service to a system that valued myth more than survival. In the end, the Zero story is not about aircraft. It is about the danger of perfection, the brittleness of optimization, and the human cost when institutions refuse to adapt. It is about what happens when you build something so good at one thing that it cannot do anything else. And it is about the men who flew it, who knew what it was, who understood the odds, and who climbed into the cockpit anyway because the alternative was unthinkable. They deserved better. They deserved an aircraft that could protect them, a doctrine that could evolve, a system that valued their lives more than its own ideology. They got the Zero, and for thousands of them, the Zero became exactly what the title promises. Not an aircraft, a coffin.